$19 million for biodiversity conservation in Nepal, $1.5 million for voter confidence. We want to give them confidence in Liberia, $14 million for social cohesion in Mali, $2.5 million for inclusive democracies in South Africa, $47 million for improving learning outcomes in Asia. Asia's doing very well. They're doing a lot better than we do in the schools, aren't they? $2 million to develop sustainable recycling models to increase socioeconomic cohesion among marginalized communities in Kosovo and Eshkali and in Egypt. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. I could, by the way, I could read this all day long. I could go on all day long, and you'll see hundreds of billions of dollars, and we're
All right, let's take
doing
a deep dive into government spending today. We're going to be looking at some claims made by former President Trump.
Oh, yeah.
At his recent press briefing at Mar-a-Lago, where he presented this list of government-funded programs and kind of hinted at some questionable uses of taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is we're not just talking about abstract budget debates, right? We're looking at specific programs, specific figures, and, you know, of course, anytime Trump says anything, it sparks controversy.
Always, yeah. So we're going to break down these claims and, try to give a little context and let you, the listener, form your own conclusions.
Always a good plan.
So to kick things off, Trump kind of dropped a bombshell about Social Security.
Okay.
He claims that millions of people over the age of 100 are receiving benefits. He even cited figures like 121,000 individuals are supposedly aged 160 to 169 receiving Social Security benefits.
Wow.
And then he even mentioned someone receiving benefits at 360 years old.
Now, 360 years old, that would mean this person was born before the United States even existed.
Right.
So that sounds like a clear case of fraud, right?
Right.
But before we jump to conclusions, I think we need to think about, how is data collected and maintained, especially when you're dealing with records that old? Like, imagine trying to track down a birth certificate from the 1600s.
Yeah, data decay is a real issue, especially when you're talking about systems as large and complex as Social Security.
Absolutely.
But even with potential errors, these numbers are still kind of startling. What does it mean for the program's future if even a fraction of these claims are true?
Yeah, it raises some serious questions about the accuracy of government data, the potential for waste and fraud, and ultimately the long-term sustainability of Social Security. And this is a program that millions of Americans rely on.
Right.
So any questions about its integrity, I think, need to be taken seriously.
Absolutely. And it gets to the heart of this bigger issue of how can we as citizens be sure that our tax dollars are being used effectively?
Right. That is the question, and one that we'll keep exploring as we look at some of these other programs on Trump's list.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about some of these internationally focused programs that he highlighted.
Okay.
Some of these are pretty eye-catching examples, like funding for voluntary male circumcisions in Mozambique,
right,
or voter turnout initiatives in India.
Yeah, and the examples, they might seem a little outlandish at first glance, but they really kind of represent this larger debate we have about the role of foreign aid.
Like you mentioned, $47 million dedicated to improving learning outcomes in Asia, which is interesting because he also claims that Asian schools already outperform American schools.
Yeah.
So it seems kind of contradictory, right? Like, why invest in systems that are supposedly already ahead of us?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of this debate surrounding foreign aid, right? Is it about helping other countries develop, or is it about trying to maintain a competitive edge globally?
Right. Or, you could argue that, investing in education globally benefits everyone in the long run.
Sure.
But then on the other hand, shouldn't we be prioritizing fixing our own education system?
Yeah, it's a complex issue with valid arguments, I think, on both sides.
Right.
And this is where you, the listener, come in. What do you think? What factors should guide our foreign aid decisions?
We're all stakeholders in this. Our tax dollars are funding these programs. So it's important to understand the reasoning behind them and to think critically about, what are the intended consequences and what are the unintended consequences.
Absolutely. And I think that's what this deep dive is all about. It's also interesting to look at some of the other internationally focused programs that, Trump mentioned. He brought up funding for several organizations working on democracy and governance issues, like, for instance, $32 million to the Prague Civil Society Center, $14 million to improve public procurement in Serbia, and $2.5 million for supporting inclusive democracies in South Africa.
Yeah, these programs raise a really important question, I think, about the role of the U.S. in promoting democracy globally. Is it our responsibility or even our right to influence democratic processes in other countries?
It's a very complex issue with a long history, and some argue that supporting democratic movements aligns with American values and ultimately leads to a more stable world. But others worry about, interfering in the internal affairs of other nations and potentially creating unintended consequences.
Right. And then how do we even measure the effectiveness of these programs? How do we know if they're truly making a difference?
Yeah, that's the real challenge with initiatives like these. It's very difficult to quantify the impact of democracy-building efforts. It's not always about immediate results. It's about fostering this long-term change, which can be a very slow and nuanced process.
It's a good reminder that we can't always look for simple solutions to complex global challenges.
Exactly, and it's important to consider the perspectives of, the people and the countries involved. What might seem like a well-intentioned effort from our perspective could be perceived very differently by those on the receiving end.
Let's shift gears again here and talk about another area that caught Trump's attention. Environmental initiatives, particularly those overseas.
All right.
He specifically called out the $520 million for environmental consulting in Africa.
Mm.
He also mentioned funding for biodiversity conservation in places like Colombia and Nepal.
Right.
This ties back to the debate we were having earlier about foreign aid priorities, right? Is it our responsibility to fund environmental projects in other countries? Or should we be focusing on domestic issues first?
Right.
Well, some might argue that environmental issues are inherently global, right? Climate change, pollution, deforestation, these problems don't respect national borders. What happens in one part of the world affects us all.
Think about the Amazon rainforest, right? I mean, that plays a crucial role in regulating the global climate. So deforestation there has implications for the entire world, including the U.S. Investing in its preservation could be seen as a form of self-preservation.
Right, it's like that old saying, think globally, act locally, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. There's also a humanitarian argument to be made. Environmental degradation disproportionately impacts vulnerable populations. It exacerbates poverty and health issues. So investing in sustainable development can improve lives and create a more equitable world.
And there's the economic angle, too. Investing in clean energy, sustainable agriculture, and green technologies can create jobs and boost economies, both domestically and internationally.
It's really fascinating how all these different factors, the environmental, the social, the economic, they're all interconnected. It's a reminder that, government spending decisions are rarely straightforward.
It's about weighing different priorities, considering potential benefits and risks, and making informed choices about how we're using taxpayer dollars.
Absolutely, and that requires transparency and accountability. We need to be able to track how these funds are being used, assess the effectiveness of these programs, and ensure that they're actually achieving their intended goals.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. What do you think about all of this? How do you feel about the U.S. funding environmental projects in other countries? Is it a worthwhile investment?
These are the kinds of questions that I think we should all be asking ourselves. After all, we're the ones footing the bill, right?
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the big numbers and all the political rhetoric around government spending.
Right.
But these decisions really do have consequences for people all over the world.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, there are often valid arguments on both sides of the debate.
Right.
It's not always about right versus wrong, but about, carefully considering those different perspectives, weighing priorities, and ultimately making tough choices.
And speaking of those tough choices, let's circle back to that $47 million for improving learning outcomes in Asia that Trump mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed a little odd considering his assertion that, Asian schools are already outperforming American ones.
Yeah.
So why invest in a system that's supposedly already ahead of our own?
It raises an interesting dilemma. Should aid focus on areas where the U.S. is lagging behind? Kind of playing catch up in a sense?
Right.
Or should we double down on areas where we have a lead, aiming to maintain global dominance?
It's almost like deciding, whether to invest in a struggling company, hoping for a turnaround, or pouring more resources into a thriving business to make it even stronger.
Exactly.
Both strategies have their merits.
Right. And the decision often depends on, a variety of factors, the specific goals, available resources, the long-term vision. In this case, you could argue that investing in education in Asia, even if their systems are already strong, could lead to further innovation and collaboration, which ultimately benefits everyone involved.
It's It's a good reminder that we shouldn't look at these issues in isolation. I mean, the world is increasingly interconnected, and what benefits one region can often have these, positive ripple effects globally.
Absolutely.
So this brings us back to you, the listener. What are your priorities when it comes to government spending?
Right.
If you were in charge of the budget, where would you allocate those funds? What criteria would you use to make those tough decisions?
Yeah, that's a question worth pondering because ultimately, these decisions shape our future, both here at home and around the world.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of all this,
Sure.
But it's crucial to remember that we, as citizens, have a voice.
Absolutely.
We can stay informed, engage in these discussions, and hold our elected officials accountable.
That's what makes a democracy work.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into government spending. We hope this has given you some new insights and perspectives to consider.
Remember, critical thinking and informed engagement are key to making sound decisions about our collective future.
Be sure to join us next time when we'll be taking a look at the world of artificial intelligence and its impact on the job market. Until then, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.